Thanks for joining me, everyone. I'm going to be detailing Wise Art Games' first production. It's a game called Frontier Tycoons. Basically, the idea of this game is it's about entrepreneurs, dawn of the American Industrial Revolution. You have the opportunities to bid on various lucrative government contracts that come up throughout the game, and the players who win these contracts gather up prestige points as the game goes on. Certain buildings that are offered on these contracts are going to give their owners access to various resources as the game goes on. Some other buildings are going to let them manipulate different mechanics in the game, use them to their advantage, and eventually, when all the prestige points run out, then the game is over and you decide who the winner is at that point in time. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to go over some of the core pieces of the game. You'll get an idea of what's provided with your copy of Frontier Tycoons. Then from there, I'm going to go over just what some of the different mechanics are, the key mechanics to getting the game going. And then we'll go over a few turns, give you some idea how that's going to work. The first thing we're going to look at over here on your right is the open market. What the open market is it's a board where players store all the different tokens, chips, pieces, everything they're going to need as the game goes on. So on the bottom we have these gold coins. It's currency that players get access to as the game goes on. It's used to bid in the contract phase of the game, which I'll detail later. But basically it's a way of winning auctions, so you want to use your money wisely. We also have your prestige points down here. The green points are worth 1. The purple chips are worth 5 points in total. And then up above here we have the 5 different resources in Frontier Tycoons. Blue represents coal, yellow represents wheat, white represents cotton, red is representing wood, and black represents oil. Players are able to trade these commodities amongst themselves throughout the course of the game, and in doing so they're going to be able to offer some good trades, some bad trades, what have you, and the player who trades more effectively is usually going to come out ahead. So, other than the pieces here, each player has in their pool a collection of 12 houses. These houses are used to mark ownership throughout the game. So as players accumulate contracts, they build buildings, they're going to use their appropriate colored houses. There's included in the game blue, yellow, green, red, and purple houses. They'll be using these and placing them on the game board in various locations depending on whichever contracts they've won. Also in the player's possessions and included in the final copy of the game, these will be appropriately colored joystick pawns. What they're used is activation markers. They represent which you have certain opportunity to use different buildings and you're not allowed to use all of them at once. So you use the activation markers to select in whatever round which buildings you're going to use for that round. So all that being said, maybe I'll get into some details of the core mechanics of the game so you can understand and put into context what all these different tokens and chips are doing. In the center of the board here, you have the main game board. It's basically a game board that's just designed to keep track of who owns what throughout the game. So it's a way of marking with the appropriate colored houses on the spots to show who owns what. So in this certain situation right now, the green player owns 2 mills and 1 labor union. The red player owns 1 courthouse and 1 farm. The yellow player owns a railroad and a farm. And finally the blue player owns a single coal mine. So finally over here on my right is the deck. This is called the contract deck in the game. The deck is filled with numerous cards that have varying contracts which correspond to the different buildings that you're going to find in the main game board. These buildings that are on the contracts have no specific price on them. The price is decided by the players. So we'll get into some of the phases of the game now so you can get a better idea of what all this means. So first up in the game, the very first phase is your activation phase. What you do in this phase is any contracts which you've collected throughout the course of the game, what you do is you take one of your activation markers and you place it on one. So the blue player would place his activation marker on his coal mine, since That's the only building that he has in his possession. The yellow player gets to activate 2 buildings. One is the production buildings, which is an oil well, a mill, plantation, a farm, and a coal mine, which produce oil, wood, cotton, wheat, and coal respectively. He also gets to place an activation marker on one of his manipulation buildings. The manipulation buildings are a railroad, a courthouse, a labor union, a shipyard, and a city hall. So he'll place an activation token on the farm, also place an activation token on the railroad, because he owns both and he's allowed to. Now, if he had owned a farm and a plantation, he'd be forced to choose either the farm or the plantation this turn. Can't choose both. Now we move over to the red player, also owning a farm, so he places the activation token on his farm and then onto his courthouse. Finally, the green player has 2 houses on the mill, but they only have to put an activation token on it once. In doing so, that's going to help him generate some extra revenue or resources this turn by having two houses on the mill instead of 1. And then he can place his other token on the labor union. If we had a scenario, like I said, where the yellow player also had the plantation, he would have to choose between the plantation or the farm. Equally, let's just say, for instance, that the red player had a shipyard or a courthouse, they'd have to be forced to choose either the courthouse or the shipyard. They're not allowed to choose both in a turn unless they have access to a factory, which you'll have to look at the main rules of the game to see all the details and what those do. After players go through the activation phase, we go into the collect resources phase. In this phase, each player collects 1 gold coin. So 1 coin would go to the blue player, 1 to the yellow player, 1 to the red player, finally 1 to the green player. Then they'll collect resources. Now it's important to note that as the game goes on, you have this black pawn which represents the active player marker. That means just who's player 1, essentially. So in this scenario right now, player 1 is the blue player. He's the active player this turn, so he'll collect his resources first. So since all he has is the coal mine, which is activated, he's going to take 1 blue chip for 1 unit of coal. The yellow player, who has chosen to activate his farm, is allowed to collect 1 yellow chip. Finally, moving over to the red player, for him, he has still 1 farm as well, so he also collects 1 yellow chip, which is a wheat. Finally, the green player, who's activated his mill, is allowed to collect 2 of the wood chips. So he takes those and he puts them into his pool. Now players have finalized collecting their resources, so they move on to the next phase. This is the trading phase.